Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about the Taiwan situation. They assume that China is building up military capability with the genuine intention of launching an amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Strait. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? The People's Liberation Army has been modernizing for decades, constructing amphibious assault ships, conducting exercises that look exactly like invasion rehearsals. And Xi Jinping himself has refused to rule out the use of force. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how the Taiwan crisis actually works. What if the entire military buildup is not preparation for an invasion that Beijing intends to execute, but rather a trap designed to force the United States into choices that accelerate American decline without China ever having to fire a shot? Because the moment you actually start pulling on that thread, you realize the answer is not what most people expect. The conventional narrative treats the Taiwan question as a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when China's military reaches sufficient capability to execute the crossing. But that framing misses the strategic architecture underneath everything. Beijing is not building toward invasion. Beijing is building a permanent crisis that reshapes the entire Pacific power structure through sustained pressure rather than climactic confrontation. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what amphibious invasion actually represents as a military operation. This is not a tactical question. This is a question of whether the entire operational concept is even viable given the geographic, logistical, and strategic realities of the Taiwan Strait. And the framework that makes this clear comes from a very old pattern in military history, one that keeps repeating because the underlying physics and logistics of warfare remain constant even as technology evolves. The framework is this: defensive geography defeats offensive capability when the attacker must concentrate forces in predictable kill zones while the defender can disperse and maneuver. We saw this at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off a Persian army because the terrain forced concentration into a narrow pass. We saw this at Gallipoli in 1915, where the British and French suffered catastrophic losses trying to force a landing against entrenched Turkish defenders on high ground overlooking the beaches. We saw this in the planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan in 1945, where American military planners calculated casualties so extreme that they manufactured 500,000 Purple Heart medals in anticipation, medals that are still being awarded today because the invasion never happened. The atomic bombs obviated the need for the landing, but the casualty projections remain instructive. Even with total air and naval superiority, even with the Japanese military already shattered by years of war, the physics of amphibious assault against a determined defender on prepared ground creates mathematical realities that technology cannot simply eliminate. Now bring that framework forward to the Taiwan Strait in 2026. The strait is 110 miles wide at its narrowest point, which sounds manageable until you understand what crossing that distance requires. An amphibious invasion is not just about getting soldiers to the opposite shore. It is about establishing a logistics pipeline that can sustain offensive operations against a defender who is receiving reinforcements and supplies through intact infrastructure. Think about what the invasion fleet would actually look like. You need amphibious assault ships to carry the initial wave of troops. You need landing craft to ferry them from ship to shore. You need logistics vessels to bring ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. You need warships to provide fire support and air defense. You need aerial refueling tankers, airborne early warning aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and transport planes for airborne operations. This is not a couple dozen ships. Serious military analysts estimate that a credible invasion of Taiwan would require mobilizing between 1,000 and 2,000 vessels of various types, from massive amphibious assault ships down to civilian ferries and cargo vessels pressed into military service. Here is where the trap begins to reveal itself. That fleet cannot hide. The Taiwan Strait is one of the most heavily monitored bodies of water on the planet. American satellites pass overhead multiple times per day. Reconnaissance aircraft operate from Japan, Guam, and allied bases throughout the Pacific. Taiwan's own surveillance network covers every inch of the strait. The mobilization required to assemble an invasion fleet would be visible weeks before any ships ever left port. There is no strategic surprise possible possible in this scenario, and that means Taiwan and its allies would have weeks to prepare, to disperse forces, to pre-position munitions, to move command and control infrastructure underground, to activate reserve units, and to turn every beach that could accommodate a landing into a prepared killing ground. Let me walk you through exactly why the beach landing itself represents an almost insurmountable problem. Taiwan has approximately a dozen beaches where large-scale amphibious landings are even theoretically possible. The island's western coast, which faces mainland China, is heavily urbanized in the north and either mountainous or swampy in the south. Most of the coastline is simply unsuitable for landing heavy equipment. The beaches that could work are well known to Taiwan's military, which has spent 70 years preparing to defend them. Think about what happens when the first wave of landing craft approaches one of these beaches. They are moving slowly because they are heavily loaded. They cannot maneuver effectively because they are in formation, trying to land thousands of troops simultaneously across a narrow front. And from the moment they come within range, they are under fire, not just small arms fire. Anti-ship missiles launched from mobile platforms that have been repositioned overnight. Artillery pre-registered on exact coordinates where the landing craft must slow down to unload. Mines in the shallow water that cannot be cleared because minesweepers would be destroyed by coastal defense systems. Armed drones overhead that treat each landing craft as a stationary target. The casualties in the initial waves would be catastrophic. Historical data from Normandy in 1944, where the Allies enjoyed complete air superiority and faced a German military that was fighting on multiple fronts, showed casualty rates of 50% or higher on some beaches in the first hour of the assault. Now imagine that scenario with the defender possessing modern precision weapons with no possibility of strategic surprise, and with the attacker needing to sustain the logistics flow across open water for weeks or months to achieve strategic objectives inland. Military planners use a general rule of thumb that successful amphibious assault requires the attacker to achieve at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage at the point of attack. But Taiwan has 165,000 active-duty military personnel, plus another 5 million in trained reserves that could be mobilized. To achieve 3-to-1 advantage, China would need to successfully land and sustain approximately 500,000 troops on an island that is actively resisting. That is not a number you transport in a few days. That is a sustained logistics operation under constant fire, requiring the invasion fleet to make multiple trips back and forth across the strait, while Taiwan's military and potentially allied forces attempt to sink every vessel making the crossing. Here is the second layer that makes the operation even more difficult. Even if the landing succeeds, even if the People's Liberation Army manages to establish a beachhead and begin moving inland, Taiwan is not flat terrain that allows rapid mechanized advance. The island is dominated by a mountain range running north to south down the eastern side with peaks exceeding 3,000 meters. The western side, where the beaches are located, has several major urban centers, including Taipei, Taichung, and Kaohsiung, each of which could become a Stalingrad-style urban warfare nightmare. The Taiwanese military has spent decades preparing for a defense-in-depth strategy that assumes some level of initial territorial loss, but plans to make every kilometer of advance cost the invader more than the previous kilometer. Imagine a convoy trying to advance through Taipei, a city of 6 million people with dense construction, underground infrastructure, and unlimited ambush opportunities. The vehicles stretch out along the streets because there is no physical space to maneuver off the roads. If anti-tank teams destroy the lead vehicles and rear vehicles simultaneously, the entire convoy is frozen. Now multiply that scenario across dozens of urban centers and thousands of mountain passes. Stay with me here because this is where it clicks. The operational difficulty of actually executing the invasion is so extreme that serious strategic planners in Beijing almost certainly understand it is not viable as a military operation. The casualties would be measured in hundreds of thousands. The economic cost would be measured in trillions of dollars. The timeline would be measured in years, not weeks. And the outcome would remain uncertain, even with maximum commitment of resources, because modern defensive capabilities with precision weapons give the defender enormous advantages in this exact scenario. scenario. So if invasion is not actually the plan, what is all this military buildup actually for? This is where the framework reveals the hidden architecture. The buildup is not preparation for invasion. The buildup is the strategy itself. By creating the permanent perception of imminent threat, Beijing forces Taiwan to spend enormous resources on defense rather than economic development. Taiwan's defense spending has increased substantially over the past decade, diverting funds from infrastructure, education, and technological advancement. But more importantly, the sustained crisis forces the United States into impossible strategic choices. Every time tension escalates, Washington faces the question of whether to commit more resources to Taiwan's defense. Sending additional weapon systems means depleting American stockpiles that might be needed for contingencies in Europe or the Middle East. Increasing the American military presence in the Western Pacific means extending supply lines, increasing operational tempo, and raising the costs of maintaining global hegemony. Providing explicit security guarantees risks dragging the United States into a war that would make Ukraine and Afghanistan look minor by comparison. Think about what happens when you layer on top of that the question of nuclear weapons. China possesses approximately 500 nuclear warheads as of the most recent estimates, with that number projected to exceed 1,000 within the next decade. The United States has vastly more, approximately 3,700 warheads in the active stockpile. But in a scenario where American forces are directly engaged in combat with Chinese forces over Taiwan, the nuclear dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Does the United States risk nuclear escalation to defend an island that Beijing considers a core territorial issue? Does China risk its own cities to prevent American intervention in what it frames as a civil war? These questions do not have comfortable answers, which means they create enormous strategic uncertainty that benefits the power seeking to disrupt the status quo at the lowest possible cost. Now add to this something that makes the Taiwan situation particularly significant for the global system. Taiwan is not just strategically located. Taiwan is economically critical in ways that most people do not fully appreciate. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips. These chips power everything from smartphones to military systems to artificial intelligence infrastructure. If Taiwan's chip production were disrupted for any extended period, the global economy would experience supply chain shocks that would make the pandemic-era disruptions look manageable. Car manufacturers would halt production. Data centers would be unable to expand capacity. Military procurement programs would face delays measured in years. This creates a bizarre strategic situation where China cannot actually invade Taiwan without destroying the very economic prize it claims to be recovering, while the United States and its allies cannot allow Taiwan to fall under Chinese control without accepting economic subordination. The result is a permanent crisis that neither side can afford to resolve through direct confrontation, but that both sides can use to reshape the strategic environment. For China, the ongoing tension justifies continued military expansion, which creates employment, technological advancement, and nationalist cohesion domestically. It forces the United States to maintain expensive forward deployments in the Pacific, stretching American resources and attention. It creates opportunities to peel away American allies who calculate that their economic interests with China outweigh their security interests with Washington. For the United States, the Taiwan situation justifies the entire Indo-Pacific strategic architecture, maintains relevance of the alliance system, and provides rationale for defense spending that supports domestic political coalitions. Project this forward, and what you see is not a countdown to invasion. What you see is a permanent frozen conflict that slowly reorganizes the entire global system. China does not need to invade Taiwan to achieve its strategic objectives. China needs Taiwan to remain in perpetual crisis, close enough to Beijing's control to prevent formal independence, far enough from Beijing's control to justify ongoing pressure. Every year that this situation continues, China's relative economic and military power grows. Every year, the cost for the United States to maintain the credibility of its Pacific commitments increases. Every year, allies and partners throughout Asia recalculate whether alignment with Washington remains the optimal strategy. Here is where the implications start cascading beyond the immediate Taiwan question. The sustained crisis affects alliance structures throughout the region. Japan has committed to defending Taiwan if conflict breaks out, which means Tokyo is now planning for a war scenario that would put Japanese cities at risk of Chinese missile strikes. South Korea faces pressure to choose between its economic relationship with China and its security relationship with the United States. The Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia watch the growing tension and adjust their own strategic positioning, hedging between the great powers rather than firmly committing to either camp. This creates exactly the fragmentation that makes American alliance management more difficult and more expensive. Washington has to offer more to each ally to maintain their commitment, while Beijing can offer economic incentives to those considering strategic flexibility. The economic implications extend beyond the semiconductor question to the broader structure of Asian trade. If military tension in the Taiwan Strait makes shipping through the region more expensive or risky, supply chains begin reorganizing. Manufacturing that currently happens in coastal China or Taiwan starts relocating to Vietnam, India, or even back to North America and Europe. This accelerates the economic decoupling between China and the West that began during the trade war and intensified during the pandemic. Economic decoupling reduces interdependence, which has historically been a moderating force preventing conflict. When economic ties weaken, the cost of confrontation decreases and the probability of miscalculation increases. At the global systemic level, the Taiwan crisis represents a test case for whether the post-World War II international order can survive the return of great power competition. That order was built on the assumption that major wars between great powers were unthinkable because nuclear weapons made the cost too extreme. But the Taiwan situation exists in the gray zone between peace and war, where both sides can apply military pressure without triggering the nuclear threshold. If China successfully uses sustained crisis to achieve strategic objectives without invasion, it establishes a template that other powers can replicate. Russia has already demonstrated a version of this in Ukraine, using frozen conflict to prevent NATO expansion and maintain leverage. Iran uses similar logic in its relationship with Israel and the Gulf states. The pattern becomes create permanent crisis, avoid direct confrontation that would unify opposition, slowly reshape the strategic environment through sustained pressure. This does not mean war is inevitable. It means the conditions that make war more likely are assembling faster than the conditions that would prevent it. The United States faces the choice of either accepting gradual erosion of its Pacific position or escalating commitment to a level that becomes economically and politically unsustainable. China faces the choice of either accepting indefinite separation from Taiwan or pursuing reunification through methods that would be catastrophically expensive. Taiwan faces the choice of either accommodating Beijing to some degree or maintaining a defensive posture that consumes enormous resources indefinitely. None of these choices have comfortable solutions, which means each actor has incentive to delay resolution while hoping the strategic environment shifts in their favor. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a military problem with a military solution. What you see is a deliberately constructed trap, a trap built not through active manipulation, but through patient observation of each actor's structural constraints and strategic imperatives. China cannot invade Taiwan without suffering costs that would undermine the entire rationale for invasion. The United States cannot abandon Taiwan without accepting the collapse of its alliance system and strategic credibility throughout Asia. Taiwan cannot resolve its status without choosing between formal independence that triggers Chinese intervention or accommodation that leads to absorption. The genius of the trap is that it requires no one to make the first move. The trap tightens simply through the passage of time as relative power shifts, as economic interdependence unravels, as alliance commitments become more expensive to maintain, as domestic political pressures in all three capitals push toward harder positions. The real question is not whether China will invade Taiwan. The question is whether any of the major powers possesses the strategic flexibility to escape the trap before it forces choices that nobody wants, but that become unavoidable once the system locks into crisis dynamics. And right now, the evidence suggests that flexibility is decreasing rather than increasing. Nationalist sentiment in China makes any accommodation on Taiwan politically difficult for Xi Jinping. Bipartisan consensus in Washington treats Taiwan's defense as non-negotiable. Taiwan's own population increasingly identifies as Taiwanese rather than Chinese, making reunification harder to achieve through any means short of coercion. These trends do not point toward resolution. They point toward intensification. Empires do not fall overnight. They erode. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable speed. The next time you hear about Chinese military exercises near Taiwan, or American weapons sales to Taipei, or diplomatic tensions over Taiwan's international status, try holding all of these things together in the same frame, because they are not separate stories. They are different angles on the same story, the story of a strategic trap that works precisely because invasion is impossible, and everyone involved understands that the real battle is not for Taiwan itself, but for the shape of the global order that emerges from this permanent crisis.